As with any human endeavor, people strive to know more about everything. Run faster, jump higher, push the boundaries of medicine. The need to master the things we see and touch and feel seems to be in our DNA. Chess is no different. Of course, change only happens when a special person appears who sees things in a different light. Where the rest of the world thinks that something is all figured out, or perhaps feel that a certain problem is unsolvable, this kind of genius steps out of the shadows and literally changes reality as we know it. In this lecture, I'm going to introduce you to 4 chess thinkers who, step by step, turned to the view that chess was only a game into something far deeper. They gave birth to chess as science. Our first chess scientist was briefly mentioned in Lecture 3, where we discussed his skills at blindfold chess. But he did much more than that. Born in 1726, he was viewed as the world's best player from 1755 to his death in 1795. He was also a world-class musician who composed over 20 highly thought-of operas, many of which are available today. Philidor's chess legacies include an instructive book which was published in 1749. It became a sort of chess Bible, and by 1871 had already gone through 70 editions and several translations. He also created a chess opening for black, which is known as Philidor's defense, and a very important rook endgame position that we'll learn in Lecture 20. It's known as, and this will come as a shock to you, the Philidor position. His main contribution to chess, though, was his insistence that the pawn structure is vastly important, something that was unheard of at that time. In Lecture 12, I mentioned Philidor's profound assertion that pawns are the soul of chess, and his work in games eventually turned doubters into believers. Thanks to Philidor, what was once unknown and then somewhat controversial eventually was viewed as a scientific fact, something that every chess player who wants to improve must embrace. I want to point out something that often occurs with creative people. They become infatuated with their discoveries and make it the end-all and be-all of whatever the subject is. They overindulge in their creation and often have blinders on their eyes, not able to see a much larger picture. Philidor was no different, and while demonstrating his pawn structure philosophy, he would often go over the top, and as he stared lovingly at his pawn structure, would automatically put it above the importance of the pieces and dynamics. However, chess isn't so easy to quantify, so sometimes the structure was the most important thing on the board, while at other times it wasn't. The following game is a magical example of Philidor's handling of pawns. It vividly shows his pawn mastery in action and also shows his dynamic flaws. I can't help but imagine that Philidor was delighted. Black has a 4-2 queenside pawn majority, while white has a 4-2 kingside pawn majority. Since Philidor was the high priest of pawns, it doesn't take much thought to figure out who will be superior in their handling. Bishop e6, knight f4. This is an easy move to understand. He's trying to break the square that stops his pawn from advancing, and also just attacks the bishop. Queen e7, white makes a capture, a simple trade, and of course, castles as fast as he can. Very important. Black develops also. There goes the bishop for the knight, and now the pawns start moving. So you can see black has all these 4 pawns versus just 2 white ones over on this side, and white has 4 pawns in the center and the king side versus 2 here. So the whole battle is going to be all about these mutual majorities. Knight c7. And of course, he brings the rook over to give defense to this and try to push this pawn some more. I'm sure he's just drooling to do that. It's the only thing on his mind. Black plays g6 to try to prevent that move. And now white goes h3, and he's actually hoping to push this pawn here so he can still do that move. That's all he wants to do, is get these pawns rolling. And black pushes his own pawn, gets him going, but it allows the knight to take up a very strong position in the enemy camp. And this move prevents the knight from going to g5, but it weakens the king considerably. And now a2 is hanging the rook, the queen, so he goes b3, blocks the queen, and actually guards that pawn with the queen here. So after b3, b5, he's still using his pawn majority, and white does not relent. He keeps going for these pawns. He desperately wants to push that. Black brings his knight to a very strong post. White retreats, once again hoping for this f5 move. And this guy just jumps right in the heart of white's position. And so Philidor doesn't really care. He just takes it off, gives up in exchange for a pawn, and now once again, he's hoping at some point to be able to play that advanced push to f5. The guy takes this pawn, and Philidor once again ignores everything but what he really dreams of doing. Notice he did this because he would love to do this move. The problem is that that would leave this pawn hanging, and black could just take it. And there goes that mighty pawn duo that Philidor is madly in love with. So what he does first is he goes here guarding this a second time, and now once again he's ready for that advance. And the queen comes in here, very greedy, takes another pawn. Philidor brings this up, and he threatens to take this, followed by a mate on h7. So the queen returns back to guard this pawn, and now finally, there's almost applause in the auditorium, he finally gets the move in that he was itching to get in. And there they are, things of beauty, two pawns face to face, ready to march down the board and cause some form of Armageddon. And he says, well, let me trade queens. Normally you wouldn't because there's an attack on the enemy king. But he decided that those two pawns are so strong they would also win in the endgame. So he takes this and now hits the knight, and now he's ready to get those pawns running. The knight goes onto the totally different side of the board. So now they're not going to really help against those pawns. And finally, f6. Rook b2, hitting the bishop. The bishop moves away quietly. Now the king comes up, trying to stop the advance of the pawns, because if he pushes this, the king would take this f-pawn here. And he doesn't want that. He wants to maintain these unless he can win something enormous. So after king f7, bishop to f5, guarding this square and allowing this to happen, but he has one more piece of the puzzle yet to make, because he still can't push this pawn because the f6 pawn. And he goes knight to h5, guarding this pawn, and now finally, after all this endless preparation, he's ready to advance that pawn. Rook g8 check, bishop to g4, blocking the check, and at last, and now they're both marching, they're really far. The king moves, he pushes again, hitting the rook moves, we get a check here, and then one final move. He plays bishop to h5, guarding this, and he's ready to romp with e6 to e7, and black resigned. The game might have gone something like king f6, knight takes d5 check, making sure that he owns this square so he can push it safely, king g5, and it would end up in this dream position. The pawns have finally reached the 7th rank. One of them is going to turn into a queen, and the game is over. Though the game has many flaws, mainly due to poor defense by the opponent and missed dynamic chances for both sides, there is still a certain beauty to it. Philidor's manic desire to get his pawns moving down the board side by side, the rush when he finally succeeded in doing so, and the way the pawns continued their journey to the end of the board makes the game very special. I've played over this game dozens of times, and it never ceases to give me a great deal of pleasure. Ignoring the flaws, Philidor's handling of his pawns is extremely instructive. The merging of Philidor's pawn love with chess dynamics and subtle positional concepts had to wait for a new generation of chess thinkers to appear. This changing of the guard occurred 78 years later, when Wilhelm Steinitz turned the chess world on its head. Born in Prague in 1836, Steinitz's parents couldn't have guessed that their son would not only become the first official world chess champion, but he would also change the way chess was played. In fact, Steinitz's discoveries, many of which were viewed as cowardly, took the game, at times kicking and screaming, into the modern age. After Philidor's death in 1795, players had a bit more positional smarts due to Philidor's writing, but it was still business as usual. Tactics, violent attacks, beautiful combinations, and a play-like-a-man credo. Even Steinitz started out playing like that, and he was so good at it that he was often called the Austrian Morphy. 1872 was a very good year for Steinitz. He beat the number 2 player in a long match and won the strongest tournament ahead of all the world's elite players. But then, just 1 year later, something strange happened. Steinitz the attacker, the Steinitz who was generally viewed as the world's top player, suddenly renounced the fire and brimstone of this previous chess incarnation and created a whole new positional style. He started with Philidor's view that the pawn structure is the game's soul. Then he mixed in space, the correct positional use of the bishops and knights, and all the tenets that we now take for granted. He wrote copiously about these things, and more importantly, he also used them in his games to demonstrate just how important they are. Adolf Anderson, whom we discussed in Lecture 10, had this to say about Steinitz's new style. Kolisch is a highwayman and points the pistol at your breast. Steinitz is a pickpocket. He steals a pawn and wins a game with it. Of course, he still retained his tactical brilliance. So the mix of this, plus his newly created positional skills that other players didn't fully understand, made him pretty much unbeatable. Emanuel Lasker, the second official world chess champion, explained what Steinitz's new style was all about. In the beginning of the game, ignore the search for combinations, abstain from violent moves, aim for small advantages, accumulate them, and only after having attained these ends, search for the combination, and then with all the power of will and intellect, because then the combination must exist, however deeply hidden. Lasker took the title from Steinitz in 1894, winning 10 games and losing 5. Age was one of the factors in Steinitz's fall, but the other was that Lasker and other young players had incorporated Steinitz's teaching into their own game. Steinitz's play also had one flaw, and that was the same psychological cul-de-sac that Philidor exhibited. He was infatuated with his positional theories, in particular, in his iron belief that he could defend any position at any time against the more virulent attack. And so the old bulldog, refusing to budge, found himself wiped out from time to time by the attacking maniacs. Of course, he beat them in the vast majority of cases, but when things went wrong, they really went wrong. In this situation, poor Steinitz has been completely outplayed, but he did it to himself. He moved his queen right in the opening over and over again, just to show that he could. And his opponent, who was a great attacking player, took advantage of it. And now Steinitz, his king's in the middle, his pieces are all on the back rank, and he's just getting humiliated. And the rest of the game is just a terrible example of being totally humiliated, totally crushed. And oddly enough, this was in a match, and though he lost this game, he wiped the guy out in the match. So this was just an anomaly, which happened quite often with him when he tried to kind of show off and stick to some bizarre, leanings. So knight A8, threatening this bishop. And once the bishop goes, the rook would hang. So since he's going to lose the rook, he gives it up anyway, takes, now this bishop's hanging, so the king moves over. And then he just strips the king of any protection, sacrificing the rook, king takes, and after rook d1 check, Black's getting obliterated, he's getting mated, and he just resigned. And as I said, after this, he made a comeback and wiped his opponent out in the match. In the following game, we see the real Steinitz. In his World Championship match with Zukertort, Steinitz confounds his opponent with subtle positional play, while White, who was from the attack and then attack some more period, kept trying to get his pieces as close to Steinitz's king as possible. Here we have an isolated queen pawn, which we've already studied. But in those days, nobody really knew how to deal with it. It wasn't something that happened that often. But Steinitz played brilliantly. He goes knight b6. He somehow just knew what to do. Knight b6 controls the d5 square. White, who is a vicious attacker, keeps bringing his stuff out. Knight d5 hits the bishop retreats. Queen a5. Rook a c1, and he's just getting his pieces out, knowing that he'll punish that little problem a little later here. Knight e5, rook f d8. Queen f3, and the bishop slides back. Another wonderful move. It not only now is guarding this diagonal, but it also is guarding this weak pawn on f7, which sometimes tactically can collapse. So now everything is very tight. And Steinitz's idea is just protect my king, trade some pieces, just like we talked about earlier, and eventually that d-pawn might become weak. So after bishop e8, sterling move, the other guy still wasn't sure what Steinitz was doing. It's far ahead of his time. And White is continuing to try to do something on the king's side. He's trying to start an attack. So Steinitz decides, okay, I'm going to change the structure a bit and give him two potentially weak pawns. So he's going to create this thing here where now this pawn is the target instead of d4. But if this moves, then this would also be a target. And in some cases, even a2 could be weak. So after this, Steinitz retreats back. The guy is still looking for a way to break through. That's all they want to do is go for a checkmate. And so Steinitz starts the trade of pieces, just like we mentioned. And the guy kind of goes along with it. Rook takes. And now you notice that both these rooks are hitting both these pawns. Zukertort continues trying to do an attack. He's very good at it, but against Steinitz, it just doesn't work. So now he's aimed at this with these two pieces. Then he goes h6, stops that. The knight runs away, preparing to sacrifice itself, because that's pretty much what he does. Queen f4, Steinitz brings the queen in to stop all the nonsense. And then finally, Steinitz lashes out himself, bishop a4, hitting the rook. He counterattacks the queen. The queen retreats, and the rook gets out of danger. And then the bishop goes back, hits the other rook. And then f5. And what this does is it totally blocks the queen's access to the king's side. White continues trying to do the king. That's all he wants to do. That was very typical. Bishop e4. Steinitz just calmly refutes everything the guy's doing. And finally, a tactic for black. Rook takes c5. Rook takes e6. Check. Knight d1. And suddenly, White's the one that's being attacked. And the queen comes out, hits this rook. Queen b2, guarding the rook. Rook b1, hitting the queen. The queen has to, once again, guard this. And then he hits the queen again, even though the rook's hanging. And the problem is if he takes it, then this rook will be taken and this knight will fold. So the poor guy is desperate. So he goes rook takes e4, queen takes, and after this, Zukertort resigned, since he's losing massive amounts of material. The point is, if he takes this rook, mate. What we saw there was dealing with the isolated queen pawn in the way we've discussed in the past, defending calmly, and then once everything is developed, you've stopped the threats, then you do your own offensive, and in this case, some tactics allowed Steinitz to turn the tables and totally wipe his opponent out. Poor Zukertort playing in the style of Romantic Age, attacked and attacked, only to be kicked to the curb by positional skills he wasn't able to deal with. Like all famous people, Steinitz had crazed detractors and adoring fans. He also had outrageous highs and, sadly, gut-wrenching lows. He never fully recovered from the death of his beloved 21-year-old daughter in 1888, and that loss was compounded by his wife passing away in 1892. After losing the title, Steinitz was still a force to be reckoned with. But the new champion Lasker was simply too strong. Steinitz was brutalized in the 1897 return match. 10 wins for Lasker, just 2 for Steinitz. And he died depressed, penniless, and suffering from mental illness in 1900. Upon hearing of Steinitz's death, Lasker wrote, "I, who vanquished him, must see to it that his great achievement, his theories, should find justice, and I must avenge the wrongs he suffered." Though his end wasn't pretty, his legacy would have made him proud. Today, Steinitz is universally viewed as the father of modern chess. Emanuel Lasker wasn't the only player to learn from Steinitz's teaching. A German medical doctor named Siegbert Tarrasch treated them very seriously, made some adjustments to the Steinitz doctrine, which tended to make them easier to understand, and became not only one of the most important chess teachers, but one of the strongest players in the world from 1890 to around 1914. Indeed, many viewed him as the #1 player from 1890 to 1893, but he never challenged Steinitz due to the time constraints created by his medical practice. And when Lasker appeared on the scene, all world championship dreams were shattered. Though the prime Lasker was untouchable, I personally view him as the greatest player of all time. He retained the title for 27 years, a record that will never be broken. Lasker never created a school of chess thought, preferring to concentrate on mathematics and philosophy. Tarrasch, on the other hand, wrote several instructive chess books, which fueled a whole generation on the subtleties of positional chess. He took Steinitz's ideas, streamlined them, made him accessible to the masses, and mixed in his personal love of space and his hatred of a lack of it, famously saying that a cramped position had in it, by definition, the germ of defeat. The following game shows Tarrasch at his best, annexing as much space as possible, leaving the opponent helpless, and only then going for the knockout. Tarrasch loved space, and in this game, it's exactly what he's doing. He has more space because of these 2 pawns. They're keeping the enemies at bay, but so far Black has enough space to breathe, so it's not the end of the world. So Tarrasch will continue gaining space and continue, and let's have a look at how he does it. He plays Rook D1, putting a little pressure on this pawn here. His opponent moves back because he doesn't have much to do, and now H4, gaining more space and taking this square away from Black's knight. He likes to deprive the enemy pieces of squares. So the knight moves here. And then Tarrasch simply guards the pawn, the knight moves back, and then he guards this pawn here. So everything is tight and safe. In the meantime, that space is just stopping Black from really doing anything that's scary or dynamic. So knight H8, and now the knight heads towards the other side of the board. Queen C7, and then he doubles rooks. And suddenly he's looking for advances here so he can rip open this file and wipe out the enemy king. So his opponent plays Queen F7, trying to bring some pieces over there to defend, and the knight hits the rook and goes to a much more active position. The rook retreats, G5. Suddenly those rooks are looking scary. He takes, rook takes, G6, and the knight comes in even more. Suddenly you have this bishop swooping down. The rooks are swooping here. This knight is hitting this square and also coming, perhaps at H6 at some point. And you can just see that strange mix of all these pieces covering all these squares. And then you look at Black's army, all huddled, quivering in a corner, quite sad. He moves his rook up, trying to block this. He decided that this diagonal would be a real problem. If he didn't do that, at any moment, White could have played something like Queen c3, doubling and trying to come right in for a mate. So he figured he had to block this dark square. And after rook e5, Tarrasch didn't care. He wanted to keep that open, and so he played f4, hitting the rook and demanding it move. The trouble is, if he played this move, Queen c3, and there's absolutely no way to save yourself from some sort of quick mate on this diagonal without just giving away a whole rook. So he saw that. He has to move the rook somewhere, and so he took this knight. E takes, finally getting rid of that horrific piece, and then he just keeps cracking through, hitting the queen, and enough was enough. And he resigned because after h takes g6, bishop takes, king takes, f5, he's not only down material, but Black is also about to get wiped out with moves like pawn takes, whatnot, queen checks here, and you know, it's no fun. If you're down material, that's one thing, that's not fun. But if the guy's also destroying your king, then you just want to walk away from it. And so the game ended. Like Philidor and Steinitz before him, Tarrasch was somewhat dogmatic, and he suffered from the same I am right and my views are law mentality. Anyone in any field who thinks in such rigid terms will be challenged, and Tarrasch was no exception. After World War I, which gutted Tarrasch and many other players, chess thought was progressing at an amazing rate, and much of his work was criticized by the hypermodern chess school, which was led by several original chess thinkers, the most famous of which was Aron Nimzowitsch. Born in Riga in 1886, Nimzowitsch was sent by his father to Berlin to study philosophy and mathematics in 1904. But instead, he constantly played chess in the Berlin coffee houses. Continuing on the parents' worst nightmare path, Nimzowitsch eventually gave up all pretense of an academic career and instead devoted himself to chess and only chess. A lot has been said about the antagonism between Nimzowitsch and Tarrasch. This mutual hatred started when both players happened to be in a coffee house at the same time, and Tarrasch agreed to play an offhand game with the young 18-year-old chess newcomer. In my view, a world-class grandmaster offering to play a friendly game with an unknown teen was a very kind act on Tarrasch's part. But the famous German made a huge mistake when after Black's 10th move, he, Tarrasch was white, told Nimzowitsch, "Never in my life have I had such a one game after 10 moves as I have now." Nimzowitsch, apparently not aware of what trash talking is all about, took it seriously and decided then and there that Tarrasch was going to be his lifelong enemy. Years later, Nimzowitsch wrote how this episode helped him learn how to play chess properly, and how this improvement would not have happened without the hateful relationship they shared. He then added, "I can therefore pass the following pleasant advice to all my readers. If you wish to achieve results, select an arch rival and attempt to punish him by toppling him from his pedestal." He then raved about Tarrasch's failings. Tarrasch, to me, was always mediocre. It is true that he was a very strong player, but all his views, his sympathies and his antipathies, and above all, his inability to create new ideas, clearly proved the full mediocrity of his cast of mind. I myself, who paid homage to genius, could in no way be reconciled to the fact that mediocrity could stand as the leader of the dominant school. This fact for me was a veritable outrage. I bring this up for a few reasons. One is that it's great fun, and that it illustrates that many of the top players simply didn't like each other. Another point is that chess thinkers were very serious about their ideas, to the point where some thought that opposing concepts didn't deserve to exist. Indeed, this was life and death stuff. Finally, we see that Nimzowitsch was extremely high-strung, and he was quite obviously a raging egomaniac. But pushing his manic side away, Nimzowitsch was also a genius, and his ideas often challenged Steinitz's and Tarrasch's precepts. And so, once Nimzowitsch and others announced the creation of the hypermodern school, a nasty war between the two schools ensued. Where the Tarrasch school insisted that the center is everything, the hypermoderns prized the wings. Where a big pawn center was considered to be a huge advantage, the hypermoderns viewed the same center as a target that should be deconstructed bit by bit. Oddly, it took Lasker to put out the flames. The second world champion had lost his title to the brilliant Cuban Jose Capablanca in 1921. Lasker, in his 50s, was thought to be a spent force. When a very strong tournament was organized, it was filled with the cream of the hypermoderns, with Reti leading the charge. And there was Lasker, now 54 years old, whom critics insisted wouldn't be able to deal with the new chess that he couldn't comprehend, or the stress of top-level competition. Yet, the old man, who never really cared for chess schools, crushed everyone and easily won the event. The lesson that Lasker taught was quite simple. Both schools are valid, and the ideas of both the Steinitz-Tarrasch schools and hypermodern schools need to be incorporated into one's game if you want to be successful. We have a normal French defense. The usual thing, the d4 pawn is attacked, which we've seen before in other French defenses we've looked at. And black keeps piling on pressure against d4. And now he takes this pawn and actually helps him develop. There's a method for his madness. He castles, black hits the center again, and now he pushes this bishop away with the b pawn. And after it retreats, he guards this square with his piece, and we reach this key position after a couple more captures. At the time, this was all completely new. And if you look at this position, well, we'll go one more, but if you look at it here, you'll notice that white has total domination of these two key central squares. And what he's going to do is continue to dominate those squares and leave the center of black's immobile. So after knight d2, castles, he brings the knight here. That adds to the domination of those squares. Bishop to d6, queen e2, rook a c8. Notice that this c-pawn is defended by the bishop. So the bishop retreats back, so it can keep an eye on that. The queen moves, and now the knight takes its place. Another delicious square. And using all the center as basically homes for his pieces. Bishop e8, rook a e1, continuing to overprotect this key point. He can't take it anymore. He takes it. It was too much pressure for him. So he gobbled it up. Queen c6, bishop d4 again, and now this is a weak pawn. So the bishop has to go back and guard it. Queen c2. Now he's turning his attention to the enemy king after totally killing black's center. Rook f7, and now rook e3. And white had an enormous advantage. He's going to end up playing moves like, f4, bring the other rook over to e1, and just dominate the file, pressure this, and black has no legal moves and just waited to die, which eventually occurred. Nimzowitsch went on to become one of the top 3 or 4 players in the world during the mid to late 20s. And his books, My System and Chess Praxis, are must-reading for all chess players. He died in Copenhagen in 1935 at the age of 48. Nimzowitsch is remembered as one of the most important chess writers in history, and his ideas, so revolutionary in his time, are now known to every chess-loving man, woman, and child.